Today we focus our Alive and Well STL lens on community trauma and racial equity. And I am so pleased to be joined by Khatib Waheed, who is the founder of RELE, which stands for the Racial Equity and Learning Exchange. Let's start a little bit about what brought you to this work in the first place, Khatib.
That's a good question, Jade. I've actually been involved in various levels of systems change, community and family engagement for over 40 years. My first real exposure was while I was still in college, where we experienced some levels of institutional racism and made a choice to address that in the ways that were available to us at the time. Mm-hmm. And then subsequently began to do some work within St. Louis Public Schools, working with middle school students teaching African American history. And there was an unfortunate incident at one of those schools where a young man attempted to commit violence after school against some of the school staff. And it just brought home to me the awareness that there were things that are happening in the lives and homes of children that go often unnoticed in the school setting. And that failure to seize those opportunities to address those needs seemed to me to be a real lost opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to take on a posture of trying to bridge or serve as a bridge between the needs of families and communities and schools and other institutions, and have been attempting to do that ever since. Mm-hmm. So about 40 years or more.
Right. So you started as a young man as well then.
Yes, many moons ago.
Which then brings to light the framework that you put in your conversation, that what was available at the time.
Yes.
And what's powerful about that to me is that, one, you were aware that the racism you were experiencing was institutionalized.
Yes.
And that there was a gap or difference in what you were able to do about it.
Yes.
But yet still felt and knew there was something that had to be done.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me more about what happened at that moment or when you became aware?
Well, see, I think it might be helpful to just make a distinction between how some of us talk about racism, and there are at least 4 different levels or types. And often when many of us hear the terms racism, we're thinking about one-on-one experiences where people are experiencing harsh language or direct harsh treatment because of their race or ethnicity and so forth. And while that is very important, you will find many people today who will say they no longer experience that. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't exist. And so in their minds. And so if that's the only lens or the only way of understanding racism, then I think we missed the point.
Sure.
And so to your question, the institutionalization of racism is still very strong. We're still living with a huge legacy that grew out of Jim Crow and that era before Jim Crow, after the Civil War and before the Civil War, that we've not yet as a nation fully rectified.
Sure. And then would that be level 4 on the...
That would be levels 3 and 4. So the institutional has to do with, how policies have a disparate impact. In other words, we get confused when we we fail to recognize that there's a difference between intention and impact. Mm-hmm. And so
what is that distinction?
Well, the distinction is that, with respect to impact, is that folks can be well intended, really have the best of goals in mind, but because they're not aware of all of the nuances that are in play in whatever it is we're talking about addressing, the results still disadvantage blacks and brown folks at a higher rate. Mm-hmm. And so it's not enough just to look at intent. It's important to look at impact. And so there are a number of policies that have been instituted over the years that disproportionately and adversely impact blacks and brown folks. For example, in 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Act, which required very harsh penalties for the use of marijuana and for the possession and or use of crack cocaine. And black and white leaders bought into the implementation of that. It was during a period when violence was increasing, the proliferation of gangs were becoming very apparent. And there was nothing, to my knowledge, in that law that said anything about we're going to deliberately target black and brown communities.
Sure.
Right?
That wasn't the intent.
That was not
or
the stated
implied,
intent.
Yes,
right.
Got it.
But the impact,
right.
how it was implemented, how it was monitored, how it was funded, had a disproportionate impact on black and brown communities, so much so that right now we have approximately 2.3 million people in prison in this country. And the United States incarcerates more adults than any industrialized country in the world. And we have another 6 million people on probation and parole. Out of that 8 million plus, 6 out of every 10 of those people are black and brown folks. You've got over 500,000 of those who are in jail or in prison for substance use, which was a huge increase from the 40-something thousand that people were incarcerated at in 1980.
Sure.
And so the impact of that not only led to higher rates of incarceration, but it also affected families. So we saw a huge increase or an uptick in the kids who went into foster care as a result of that law.
Of course.
We saw a huge uptick or an increase in the number of juveniles who went into prison or went into secured facilities. And in all of those instances, whether it was adult incarceration, juvenile certification for adult crimes, or juveniles or young people going into foster care, it disproportionately impacted our community.
Sure.
And so what I'm saying is that, to me, that's a very concrete example of how laws may not have a stated purpose of racial discrimination, but they have an impact. And then the other thing that I would just add to that is that because we as a society are not as forgiving as I think we claim to be or that we can be, so once a person leaves prison, they still have to report that they are a felon, and that impacts, in turn, their ability to earn a wage or a reasonable wage of living. And so it perpetuates the cycle of poverty. And I just think that looking at how we design laws and how we implement them requires us to be thoughtful about how is this going to impact certain communities. And when we're not comfortable talking about race, then we miss the opportunity to realize that those laws may intentionally or unintentionally disadvantage certain groups at a higher rate.
Wow. That's powerful, because my question would have been, and as we look at this through the Alive and Well STL lens, you were clear about the impact, especially in this example, on our community.
Yes.
With our training, we're talking about how that impact then creates the trauma. So now I'm seeing 3 vicious cycles that then swirl within one another.
Yes.
You mentioned the poverty cycle.
Yes.
The incarceration, mass incarceration, imprisonment cycle.
Yes.
And then one that then goes directly to our community response and trauma.
Yes, our
cycle,
emotional well-being.
Our emotional well-being, because there's a cycle there too.
Yes, it is.
And so with all of these things swirling together in one specific space,
yes,
I envision these things are all going to just amplify and keep fueling and feeding within each focus. What can you tell us about the psychological and behavioral effects of this trauma?
Well, there are a number of first of all, trauma is defined in layman's terms as finding your ability to cope to be overwhelmed by those circumstances.
Finding your ability to cope.
Yes. Trauma overwhelms one's ability to cope.
Yes.
And there's so many different symptoms of it that have to do with inability to sleep, high levels of anxiety and hypervigilance,
Sure.
The inability to maintain good relationships, becoming detached and losing interest in things that once were very exciting for a person, taking on substances, using substances to cope with the pain and the loss. And when I think about those kind of symptoms and that are associated with trauma, there are a couple of different ways that I think about it, and some people talk about it. One is like what's called a post-traumatic stress disorder, where, in essence, a person has experienced an event or a series of events that has affected their ability to cope, whether it's in their workplace or within family or in school or wherever. But the key word there is post, because at some point that experience has ended. Yeah. And so then at a certain point, the treatment is provided. Right. But some other folks have looked at the issue. Ended, yeah, some others have looked at it and said that for certain people, there is no post. There is no end to it. It's continuous. And so for some of our children, for some of our mothers, for some of our fathers and siblings and relatives, the trauma is ongoing, and the availability of services to address that are very, very limited. Exactly. So, for example, at the same... Or inaccurate, even. And yes, because when we think of it would be classified differently. Yes, yes. And then something that jumped out that you were saying there was losing the excitement of something that once thrilled you. If you're born into a dismal situation... Yes. You know, thank goodness for the simple things that can bring life and joy and excitement. But if that is in the midst of an already chaotic situation, then where do you have your starting point? No, I think that's right. And so one of the realities is that for some of those individuals, there's a lack of hope. And that's normal kind of for them. Yeah, and it becomes normal for them. There's a kind of an ongoing and constant state of depression and a sense that, things will never get better, and really not having a sense that things are better in other places. So it's a huge concern for a lot of us. I remember doing some work years ago in an initiative called Caring Communities. Okay. And I've shared this story with folks before. Where in certain neighborhoods we were working very closely with children and families and community residents, and there were a number of occasions where we saw or witnessed the end result of a violent act, where the person's remains were left on the street or in a vehicle or something. And when I went to those scenes, I would often notice that there would be children observing the tragedy. And what really troubled me at that time, and this was like 1980s and early 1990s, that the children on the surface showed little or no emotion. And it really troubled me, and it troubles me to this day, because growing up as a kid, I would have shown some kind of expression. If I wouldn't have been in tears, I would have been cursing. I would have been showing some outward display of emotional displeasure and pain. But for those children, they didn't show it. And what that said to me was that they had been exposed to too much at an early age. And I'm talking 1990s now. I'm not talking 2016 and 2017. Where it's right. So if you fast forward that to now, our children and our grandchildren are exposed to even more through the media and through lived experiences. And to me, I think that notion of continuous traumatic stress applies to them. And we've got a whole community. We've got communities like that all across the nation, where kids and families are predisposed to a greater likelihood of experiencing trauma, where they're going to hear about a murder or an assault, or they're going to witness a murder or an assault, or they may be the intended victim of a murder or an assault. And so when we're thinking about kids, we're expecting these children to come to school and to focus on math and reading and physics and geometry and biology and English lit and those kind of things, without adequate resources to address those things that are getting in the way of them being able to cope. Sure. They're not able to cope with those things. And I want to say that because of Alive and Well and because of the Department of Mental Health and a lot of people like at Places for People at Joe Yancey and some work that Demetrius Johnson at his foundation have been doing, and a number of other people. I may get myself in trouble calling out names, but
we've had them all on as well.
But the point to me is that there are a number of people who increasingly are aware of this phenomenon and the impact that it has. And in my work with St. Louis Public Schools, for example, the district is really now trying to pay attention to that. The challenge for a district like SLPS is the lack of resources.
Okay.
It is, and again, this would be an example of structural racism.
Okay.
There's no one. We've got a powerfully bright and committed superintendent, right?
Yes, we do.
Dr. Kelvin Adams really does get it, but he can only do so much. We need the resources so that when the children come to the building, and he is, by the way, trying to find those resources, right? But we need the resources so that when those children come to the building, there's a place for them to go, people with whom they can talk to get the ongoing therapy.
So that's what you would classify as available resources. So we talked about your early days where you used what was available.
Yes.
Are the resources available to address what is newly becoming aware of?
No.
Do they exist? Okay, so then they not only need to be created, then we also need access to them.
I think that's right. I mean, it is growing, but what gives us a reason to pause is that we really don't know how many people have experienced trauma because we're not doing the assessment, right? And so one can only guess and speculate. But we had over 180 murders last year and over 180 the year before. Multiply that times the number of people who are in those families.
Right.
And then we could ask a simple question, are there enough therapists? Are there enough clinical staff in the region who can relate to those families from a culturally competent, culturally sensitive perspective that will have the time to build the trust first to overcome the stigma that are associated with getting services like that, and then spending the time and making a commitment to actually make a difference. And I would say to you that there are people who are really trying to do that, and there are people who are doing that, but I don't think that there are enough. And so when I go back to St. Louis Public Schools, for example, at too many of the buildings, and again, this is not a criticism of Dr. Adams or the SAB, but it's a reality that because we serve poor communities, economically impoverished communities where the violence is actually occurring, we don't have enough social workers at each of those schools. Sure. We may be lucky to have 2 social workers to serve a whole student population and maybe 1 or 2 counselors. That is not enough.
Right. And then for them to serve in the ways that are necessary, they would need to be fortified as well.
Yes.
And those willing to be in the spaces to serve would come from a similar circumstance and background.
That's exactly right.
There's the enormity of this, I have to say, is breathtaking.
It is.
Although what I see in your eyes and that is welling up in me is an excitement and fire to take it on.
Yes.
Because clearly there's a need and we're that determined to do something about it. Would money be the remedy?
I think funding is a key step, but I also think training and preparation and incentives to retain really good staff. I think awareness. Mental health is still, I think, a field that people have a lot of questions about, and there are those who question the validity of it because the symptoms of mental illness are not always so apparent. I mean, we have those stereotypical kind of images where you see a person that may be homeless and is unkempt and lost so forth and dealing with schizophrenia or depression or whatever. But there are people who are experiencing levels of depression and coping with it or experiencing high levels of trauma and self-medicating either with alcohol or with opiates or with marijuana. And we have no idea of food and sex and then avoidance and a whole bunch of things.
Right. Yes. But the thing is, like you laid it out in the beginning, that we're overwhelmed by the event or series of events and are not able to cope.
Yes.
The coping is there's not something that has to cover, relieve, or numb us. The coping is we can traverse it, face it, and continue to function and flourish.
I think that's the key. I think that's the key, Jade. It's functioning at a high level.
Exactly, and flourish. Yes, sir. Because again, there's a somewhat overwhelming state of inaction.
Yes.
And ignorance.
Yes.
That can exist when you're overwhelmed too.
Absolutely.
That, what do they call that? That paralyzation.
Yes.
Emotional paralysis. Thank you.
Yes.
I get a whole bunch of thoughts and words going at once. What I see here, though, in the power of your example and in your life, but what we're doing with Alive and Well STL is that if we can't find the staff and fully train and make aware folks in those key specific positions, then we all become that as you are living it. When I think of, and some of the math you were doing, the compounded impact of not only the lived experience, but what we see on our devices that may be happening to other people's lived experiences, is that you also have a compound impact. So do we all. Look at the lives that you're touching by your teaching, by your organization, one by being real, but by bringing the awareness and openness to it, so that when we know what's going on with us, or we know where to get some help, or we start addressing the problem, like you said, to even create some resources to avail. And I think we're going to have to become those resources ourselves.
Yes.
Like for the numbers of people that have to have it, I don't know that we could stop the leak, the bleeding quickly enough and effectively enough by trying to supply staff for it all. It's just so huge. You put it in perspective about how huge it is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
We have to become those things for one another.
Yes, I think that's right.
And we can be that within our families and with one another, and through these same means that we're being supplied more trauma and more stress, then I guess my mission with it is that through these means, that's where those healings will have to come.
Yes.
And that's where that trust will be established, because somewhere in there's a sense of, hey, well, then that's okay if it's been on TV, or hey, that's true if I heard it on the radio. And what we've utilized with media, with Alive and Well STL, and why you're here even in the studio now, is utilizing media to impact and affect change.
Yes.
As opposed to just reporting it.
Yes.
And honestly, with your heart and mission, to me, it's like an antidote infused, some healthy cells into a toxic body that can then regenerate new healthy cells and heal our community.
Yes.
What do you feel are our tools, and what would you encourage us to do in implementing them to make a real change here and save the spirit and emotional well-being, emotional wealth of our community?
Well, that's a great question, and there are just so many tools, many of which I'm not yet aware of.
Okay.
Right? And I don't
that's one. Let's become aware.
Yeah.
Better figure that out.
But I think one of the simplest places to start,
yes, sir,
place where every individual can start, is to embrace a different way of looking at these phenomena.
Okay.
So what do I mean by that? Right now, when we see a person acting inappropriately or on whatever level, whether it's in the classroom or in the family, domestically or in the community or within the professional fields, is we ask the question, what is wrong with that person?
Quickly.
What is wrong with those people? What's wrong with that mother? What's wrong with that dad? What's wrong with that child? What's wrong with that police officer? What's wrong with that teacher? And And to shift from that, to start asking, what happened to that child? What happened to that parent? What happened to that community? What happened to that police officer? What happened to that counselor? What happened to that judge? What happened to that community? The asking the question, what happened, has, among other things, a level of empathy, implied empathy there. It's an inquiry around not judging.
Yes.
The former question of what's wrong with it really suggests that you've already made up your mind that person has something wrong with them, and that it may or may not be reparable.
That's right. Which puts a blockage.
It puts a huge barrier or blockage between
the second question
what's
gives
possible.
An opening.
Yes,
creates a possibility.
And so, I mean, there's this. So just starting there, because too many of us say things all the time that kind of normalizes what might be considered a mental illness or some emotional pain. We'll say things like, well, you know, that kid ain't the sharpest pair of scissors in the drawer, or, you know, they've got a couple of loose bolts missing, or the elevator doesn't all the way go up to the top floor, and those kind of things. You got some
of the ones that came out the circle, the Johnin circle. Yeah, but what that does though, and it's a phrase that I've been using, we've made it too okay.
Yes, and it is that's really a good way of saying it. We've made it normal, we've made it okay, and so imagine a person who is struggling with trauma or who has experienced high levels of stress and that has become toxic. And they're hearing how people are making fun of that. And so what we find is that discourages that person from getting the help that they need and deserve.
Right.
Yes.
So it certainly has to elevate that level for them too.
Right. So
imagine if it was your own thing. See, this is what I want people to do as well. I want each of us to say, in your hardest, darkest day, what is the thing you need most and the thing you need least? And relate that to the person you're dealing with.
Yes.
This is probably the last thing they need. Right. Is for me to be
making light of their condition.
Exactly.
Yes.
You know, and with the ladies, don't say, just calm down.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Very powerful. Where would you encourage us to, of course, plugging in with the Alive and Well STL movement, where can we find out more about you, get connected with your work? How can people find you online?
I do have a website. It's khatibwaheed.com. And I can also be reached through email at khatib.waheed@sbcglobal.net. I'm still, we joked, but seriously, about my challenges technologically. So I'm learning now how podcasts work.
Oh, we got you covered.
And Facebook and those kind of things.
Covered.
I'm still stuck in the previous century.
That's all good. In one sense, but a lot is still the same.
Yes.
So we've got you covered. Phones still work and are a valid means of communication, and so is email. And so the email again is Khatib Waheed.
Khatib.waheed. At sbcglobal.net.
At sbcglobal.net and khatibwaheed.com. Again, the aliveandwellstl.com to plug into some ways to discover what to ask and what to look at, even with your own circumstances. And likely, by you listening to this program, you're not immune to the things that are happening in and around us, but you most certainly can be a part of what will shine light in those dark places.
Absolutely.
It's how wonderful to have had this conversation with you today, and so admire the work that you do and have been at.
I appreciate the opportunity, and if I may, if I have just one quick second.
Yes, if there's anything I missed, in fact.
Every Thursday, from 6 to 8 p.m., I'm a part of an effort with Joe Yancey at Places for People, and it's connected with some work at St. Louis Public Schools, where we convene homicide trauma support group meetings. And these are meetings for persons who've lost a loved one to gun violence. And we've been meeting there at the Demetrius Johnson Foundation for well over 3 years, every Thursday. And we want to encourage persons who have experienced that tragic loss to consider showing up. We welcome you. We wish that you did not need the services, but we welcome you to come and take advantage of it. There's no closed enrollment period. There are no fees associated with that. We just want you to come and know that there are people there who will embrace you.
That's right.
And encourage you. And together we take a journey towards healing. And within the last couple of weeks, we've actually begun to establish a group just for men. So that because men do process some of these things very differently.
Absolutely.
And men need an outlet for that as well, so we can curtail some of the anger and violence that comes as a result of not having healed.
Absolutely.
But again, 6 to 8 every Thursday at 724 North Union at the Demetrius Johnson Charitable Foundation, Community Foundation.
Absolutely. And we, at Alive and Well STL, in one of our earlier episodes, we went to one of those sessions. So if you want to get a feel for what they do and really the heart behind it, you can listen to that episode, as well as an episode with a father who has 2 sons and lost nephews, and shares his heart directly of how he copes and takes on the stress and trauma of having lost a loved one to gun violence. Khatib, you said we.
Yes.
Did you also lose a loved one to gun violence?
Well, no. I've had members of my family who have been victims of gun violence, but as I think about it, I need to take that back. I did lose a brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Years ago, who was only about 19 years old and left this space much too early. And I think about the impact that it had on my wife and her side of the family, and it was a very painful experience. And so, yes, I have experienced that as well.
How do you stay charged and
well, I think I think one of the things that helps me, of course, is my faith in God and my prayers and my religion and trying to adhere to that. I think fundamentally that's the most powerful piece. But then the love for humanity, and a particular love for my own people, because I know that we are great. I know that in spite of all of the trauma and the violence and the poverty, we still rise, as Maya Angelou says. We still accomplish so much in the midst of all of that. And that inspires me. And it just calls me to reflect on how much more we could be doing, not only as African Americans, but as a nation, as whites and Latinos and Native Americans and Asians and so forth. How much more as a nation we could really be a beacon for the world in the way that we espouse, but that we have not yet actually actualized.
Yeah.
You know, we've got good commercials about our greatness as a nation, but I think we've got a long way to go. I think there are some great things about our nation. There are some great things that we've done, and there are some great people across race and ethnicity and class that are doing great things. But I think I really believe that if we can heal, that our ability to become more human and to become more caring for other people, regardless of race and class, will grow exponentially. And I think that's part of the work. That's part of the inspiration for me to be able to actualize that and to contribute to that, so that my grandchildren, I have 8 very beautiful grandchildren, and I look forward to them having an opportunity to live a better life than I've been afforded. And my lifestyle, I think, is better than what my parents were able to experience. And it was because of them and our foreparents that have laid, foundations and made sacrifices. So it's all of that I reflect on, that inspires me and keeps me moving.
That's right. Well, that's the hope and encouragement for us all. Thank you again, Khatib Waheed, joining us today on Alive and Well STL. Learn more at aliveandwellstl.com and be encouraged. We can better manage the stress in our lives by building supportive relationships and communities. And you can bring Alive and Well STL to your community by becoming an Alive and Well STL ambassador. Ambassadors are a key part of educating our community about how trauma impacts our social, emotional, and health outcomes. If you're interested in being a part of Alive and Well STL and helping continue the conversation, please visit aliveandwellstl.com or email aliveandwellstl at stlrhc.org. We're excited to have you join us with the Alive and Well STL movement. Alive and Well STL is now a community-wide effort focused on reducing the impact of stress and trauma on our health and well-being. The research is clear. Stress and traumatic experiences are making many of us sick, and together are the leading cause of poor health outcomes. Take 5. Visit us at aliveandwellstl.com to find out where you are emotionally. Become an ambassador. Reach out and help build a supportive community. Learn resiliency skills. Get the help you need. Share your stories. Hear others. And learn more about stress and how it affects us. That's aliveandwellstl.com. Alive and Well STL is another positive production of Rare Gym Productions. Thanks for listening.